How's it going, everybody? My name is Avery, and today we're going to be looking at porting a game from SDL2 to SDL3. This is a C++ game written by the YouTuber Polymars. Polymars, I don't think he's uploaded videos in quite maybe a year or two, but even then I would recommend his channel if you guys aren't familiar with it. This game was made in 48 hours for the 2020 Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam, which is a game jam hosted by another YouTuber that I would recommend. SDL3 came out recently, in the last month or two, I believe, and I wanted to take a chance to dig at it, learn what makes it different from SDL2, and I thought porting this game was a good way. And I thought it was pretty informative, so I wanted to share step by step on what I did to port this game. To just show off the game, I'll show what I've had built, and it's right in here. Like I said, it's a game made in 48 hours for a game jam, so it's a pretty simple game. You have this little character who's afraid of your mouse. So as your mouse gets closer, you'll run away. If you're close enough and click, you'll jump. The distance is based on the scrolling, not actually your mouse moving or your guy moving. And there you go. You're supposed to just jump from thing to thing. If he were to be touched by the mouse, he dies. So it's as simple as that. Quickly, how to show how I built SDL3. The new repo, just the main branch, has SDL3. So if you were to clone or download the SDL repo, there's also SDL image, mixer, and TTF. I believe these three, I can't remember off the top of my head if they were all completely done. I can't remember if there's documentation for everything. It's all work in progress. I mean, it's an open source project, but it all seems to be working from what I can tell. So jumping into this repo, this isn't any sort of instructions that I had found, but it's using CMake. So I created a build, and then I ran CMake. I'm stopping it just because I don't actually do the build or the install. And then I did an actual make. I passed in the amount of processors that there are. And then from there, I actually just did an install sudo so it can be installed in the correct location for my SDL2 C++ project. Of course, this will work with C as well. This project just happens to use some C++ specific things, so it needs a C compiler. So here's a list of all of the commits. These ones were done by Polymars, and then this is where I worked from here. I tried to split up all the commits so you can see the individual changes. And we're going to go ahead and do a rebase just so we can kind of go through it and try to see what was different. So these are all of my commits like I mentioned. And let's do an edit on all of them. Okay. This first commit, I'll just share it in the GitHub. It's basically was just cleaning up some extra spaces. There's not really much to it. Just that, basically. Also, I wanted to point out that in the SDL3 library, you click on docs, and there's a lot of docs, and a README. There's even a migration guide from SDL2. And here it talks about function names that have changed, macros that have changed, different headers that you could use. It talks about things that have been removed that you don't need anymore. And there's also this category API where you can break it down by functions, database, structs, things like that. And you should be able to just go in here, click on any of these, and it'll at least tell you what the parameters are, what the parameter types are. It might even point you to that specific parameters wiki page as well. And this was very useful for working on this project. Now, if we were to do hit continue, we can see what I did next. Oh. Okay. So this next one I did was remove Inscription. Inscription is used for the web port the game. For this test, I wasn't going to do anything for the web. Also, there's something called SDL main, and SDL main is going to be used, could be used theoretically for building it to the web. That's just not something I've tested yet. We'll be comparing it here in Meld. Meld is just a diff tool. Let's remove the changes as we go. So that was just the flag for Inscription, and that's just in the README talking about it. There's also a flag here in the main function that basically is just checking to see if Inscription needs a ran or not. Okay. So this commit is actually about fixing an error that I found, which I later noticed that this error was actually mentioned in some pull request and possibly some issues. A pointer is deallocated. I can show you that in here. So in the main, it calls this function the window render, and it passes in a constant char from the get score. The problem is that the constant char, it's in the header, it was generated within the function, and then depending on how the memory is used, the pointer ends up dying out. So what I did was it's using a string anyway, so I just passed the string, and then I changed it after the fact. So in here, this is where I change it just to convert it to that at that point. And that seems to have fixed the issue. We do a continue. This is where we actually start getting into the SDL3 stuff. If back in the SDL library itself, there is a folder called build scripts, and it comes with a bunch of scripts that are used for a variety of things, but these rename scripts are used for updating SDL2 to SDL3. So I ran the script rename symbols, and we can see the individual changes that it did. Sorry, here it changed it from SDL quit to SDL event quit. Same with this mouse button. And yeah, this should have been part of another commit, but this was just changing. Yeah, actually this might have been part of this. But it changed the render function. And then in here, I ran the rename headers, and that one should be a little more self-explanatory. We can see that all these individual headers were changed from SDL2 to SDL3. Just like this. It's very useful to have all of these scripts. Of course, I could have done it all on my own. I mean, I would have known to change these headers, but there was a lot of things that it catches that maybe I wouldn't have paid attention to. And it just knows to replace these functions as we get to them. Of course, we're going to see that there's a lot of functions that we actually have to manually fix, but it was nice to be able to have this automated. So that's what that did, and we'll go ahead and continue. And then we changed the make file. In here, so the make file was just changed to use SDL3 instead. And we actually, from what I read in the documentation, you don't need to include this SDL3 main anymore. And here we changed a lot of the SDL recs to use SDL3. Frect is basically just means it's using a float instead of an integer. This was just because some of the functions that were being passed into were expecting an frect. Nothing was quite actually needed to use this. Just some of the functions that were already there were expecting it. Okay, and that was as simple as that. And here we also changed the mouse to use a float. Now it's just a simple fix. And then here we are going to update some of the SDL3 TTF functions. TTF is for the fonts, if you aren't familiar. We'll jump in here. And that's all done in this render class. Basically, there is this function, TTF render text blended, and it no longer took in, I believe this was a flag. Or, sorry, no, this is the old one. It required the size of the text, and it said that 0 would just be the default. So we're going to go ahead and copy that. And this next one is for updating some of the texture functions. We noticed that the rename Python scripts earlier did that for some of them, but it didn't do that for all of them. So from what I can tell, you can no longer query a texture. You want to be able to pass in a texture and then return the coordinates and the size. What you do, there's an actual individual function for getting the size, and that's all that was really needed over here. So that's what we did. That's the same thing right here. And that's going to be the same thing here. The image in it was no longer required to be called. One more thing. Okay. No, that was just the last thing. I had missed it. And here we're updating the mixer. The mixer is used for audio. This was surprisingly a simple fix, although I've read that the mixer has had some of the biggest changes. So in here we do the mix open audio. And all of this, the frequency, the format, and the channels are passed in. From what I can tell, now the creation function of that, it's been changed, and now you pass in this spec. So it's all the exact same things were just defined, and they were passed into it while creating it. And here we're going to update some of the render and the window functions. So that was all done in this render window class. A lot of the functions flags you don't need to pass in anymore. So here is the position. That wasn't required. I also noticed an SDL2 when I ran it, it happened to position the window in the middle, even though it was undefined. So when I set the position, I ended up setting it in the middle like that. And you no longer need to do SDL render accelerated. It does that by default. That's all of those changes. And here I added the basic constructor to an entity class in order to change order of the operations. That's because, as we'll see in the next one, we ended up using SDL main, which replaces our main function, and the textures were loading in, they weren't loading in the right order, because basically how it's set up right now, the texture loads in, the game starts, but once we change the actual main function, the game was started before all the textures were loading. So this is a less SDL3 specific change. I just did it so it worked with SDL3. And once we get to the actual main file, you'll be able to see what was actually done. So the player and the ground, they were created, and then I initialized them inside of this init function, and then I don't have them being created here anymore. So now the game has technically been ported, but we're going to go an extra step and use SDL3 main callbacks, which is a sort of new way of managing your SDL3 program. Basically, it will replace your main function, so you no longer need that. It'll give you a new init function, it'll give you a new quit function, it'll give you a function for managing events, and a function for managing the game loop, or the main loop. It does note that this isn't 100% maybe the best way of doing things. It might depend on your project. It also notes that I believe that the main loop will run as I could be wrong. It says something. It says specifically in the documentation, but maybe it'll run with a frequency of your display. The frequency could change, so that's something you might have to handle. And you also note that the events and the main loop, they run in parallel, I believe. So it's not going to be checking the event and then running the main loop. You kind of have to handle that a little bit. And this is going to be a lot of changes in here, so it might be a little weird to view it. But as you can see, it was all in main. All you have to do is define this macro. And this is what I mentioned earlier about the inscription. I'm pretty sure once you define this and include this main, that inscription technically could work if it's built correctly. We no longer needed this boolean for checking if the game was running. And here is the new app init. So this is a default function that the main will call on its own. It has this app state. If you look at some of the example SDL projects, you can see the app state can actually be used for, you can make a struct and do anything you want. You can save the window in there, you render in there. You could also have your player class in there if you wanted. In this example, we're not going to actually be using that. And then I just do the SDL init. I actually added this testing as well, and it uses the SDL log, and it returns a failure. So just like that. And we can see at the end of this function, we return SDL app continue. And we no longer need to run init. And the loop was changed with SDL iterate. So this is some of the biggest change. Formatting wise, it's a little weird to see because the SDL event stuff is going to be partially ran outside of it in this SDL event function. That, yeah, it's all formatted a little weird. But basically, in here, it's similar. It just has if and case statements for checking for what was pressed. And at the end, it returns as app continue. Here's the new quit. You can do the window cleanup like we did before. We close out of all this font stuff and do TTF quit. SDL quit is going to be ran on its own. And you no longer need to return anything. Then in the actual main loop, not really much was changed. It just happens to call it that way now. I believe, so this SDL delay, it was in this game loop. and there's no longer main, so I just tagged it on to the end of the iterate function, just like that. And that's everything that I did to work on this project. I have the Git repo up here, cursor custodian SDL3. I updated some of the README. You can easily find the original one along down here as well. And in the README, I mentioned some of the changes. This hasn't been tested on Windows if someone's interested in doing that. And it also hasn't been tested to build on the web. So if someone wants to do that, I would appreciate it just for your own learning. These pull requests, I did mention I fixed a memory leak, but I haven't fixed other things like sometimes you fall on the ground, it doesn't actually end the game. But hopefully this was interesting for you guys, informative. I would like to see what SDL3 projects you guys are working on. I plan on coming out with more videos about SDL3, hopefully some tutorials to show you guys how to use it more. Thanks for watching again, and see you guys again next time.